I was standing on the level 96 observation deck, sipping synthetic coffee and watching the stars, when the sky over Prime ripped open. It started as a crack, literally a tear in space, as if someone had taken reality and run a massive knife across it. Ships began pouring out of that wound in the cosmos, hundreds of them, thousands, black angular hulls covered in bioluminescent patterns that pulsed red like open sores. I dropped my cup and it plummeted toward the city's base, some 90 kilometers below. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the nightmare overhead. The alarms began to wail across all levels simultaneously, a howl so piercing it made my blood run cold. People around me froze, heads tilted back, their faces reflecting the red glow of the enemy fleet. In that moment, I knew. Our world was over, and a new one had begun, one where the rules had changed forever. The first strikes hit the upper levels, 199-98. I watched planetary shields flare in blue domes over the skyscraper spires, holding back the torrents of fire pouring from orbit. The ground beneath my feet began to vibrate, not a shake, but a hum, like a string on a massive guitar. Prime held its ground. Its reactors deep in the core at level 0 pumped power into the shields, and for the first time in my 20 years in this city, I felt like I wasn't just living in a metropolis, but inside a colossal war machine. Then, the pods started falling. I saw them through the transparent roof sections, fiery meteors that were actually drop modules the size of buses. They slammed into the upper-level platforms, and from within, they emerged. The Karites. I had only seen them in training holograms, 7-foot-tall, 4-armed creatures in exoskeletons that made them look like armored praying mantises. They marched in formation, and even from level 96 I could hear the roar of their weapons. I was mobilized 10 minutes after first contact. A message flashed on my implant. Report to the level 85 assembly point, Delta Sector, to receive gear and instructions. I was a climate control engineer. My war up until that point had been adjusting temperatures in residential blocks. Now, they were shoving an assault rifle into my hands and telling me I was a defender of Prime. Ordinary people were gathering all around me, dock workers from the lower bays, teachers, cooks, programmers, even a guy in a doctor's coat with dried blood on his sleeves. They gave us ammo, showed us how to reload, and sent us to our positions. General Caro, a woman with a face carved from granite and eyes that had seen too much death, gave the briefing in 3 minutes. She said the Karites would try to crush us with numbers, that they conquer worlds in weeks, but Prime was no ordinary world. Prime was 100 kilometers of vertical hell, and we would turn every single level into their grave. When she finished, someone in the crowd shouted the old slogan, "Prime stands!" and thousands of voices took it up. I screamed along with them, and somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and shock, something ancient and vicious woke up, a rage for my home. By the end of the first day, the upper levels had turned into a meat grinder. I dug in on level 83 in the ruins of a shopping mall that just that morning had been selling imported fruit from Terra. Now, it was nothing but a heap of concrete and glass. The Karites came in waves, their exoskeletons glinting in the firelight, and we fired and fired and fired until our barrels glowed red hot. I killed my first enemy at sunset, hit him in the armor joint at the neck. He fell, twitching, and I felt nothing but relief that it wasn't me lying on the platform. Next to me, a guy who had been telling me about his daughter that morning was killed. A plasma bolt took off half his head, and I didn't even know his name. That night, I looked up at the orbit where the fleet battle raged on, and I thought, if we fall here, if Prime falls, all of Omega-7 belongs to them. But the city held, 100 kilometers of steel and fury held firm against an army that broke worlds. And standing there among the bodies and the ruins, I realized the war was only beginning, and it would last as long as a single human heart continued to beat in Prime. The Karites expected us to break in a single day. Their intelligence likely showed an ordinary city, 1 billion civilians who would flee at the first shots. But they didn't grasp one simple fact. Prime was built by the first-wave colonists, the ones who survived on the barren rocks of Omega-7 back when there wasn't even an atmosphere here. We didn't just live in this city. We were a part of it. Every bolt, every girder was soaked in our sweat and the blood of our grandparents. When the enemy breached level 100, they weren't met by terrified clerks, but by factory crews armed with plasma cutters and homemade guns they had fashioned in their spare time for hunting mechanical rats in the ventilation shafts. I was on level 95 when I heard Foreman Koltsov from the metallurgical complex report over the radio that his men had wiped out an entire landing squad by setting a trap in a narrow passage between the furnaces. He spoke calmly, as if reporting on a completed production quota, only adding at the end that he'd lost 8 men and needed ammunition. That's how our war began, ordinary people killing the professional soldiers of an interstellar empire with improvised bombs and hunting rifles. General Caro turned the chaos of the first few hours into an organized slaughter. I only saw her in person once. She flew down to our level on a high-speed lift, inspected the positions, and in 15 minutes completely reconfigured the defense so that every intersection became a deadly trap. She used a holographic map projector to show where to set up firing points, where to prepare barricades, and how to use the city's verticality to shoot not just horizontally, but from top to bottom, turning every balcony into a sniper's nest. When one of the militiamen asked how we were supposed to hold against their armor and numbers, she looked at him until the man swallowed hard and said that every skyscraper in Prime was designed as a bunker. Every residential block could be turned into a fortress, and if the Kurites wanted to take this city, they would have to take it room by room, corridor by corridor. Then she flew off to another sector, and we stayed to execute her plan. And you know what? The plan worked. When the next wave of the enemy tried to break through along our level's main thoroughfare, we met them with fire from 3 sides simultaneously and then brought down the facade of a building we had prepared for demolition. I saw real, proper blood on the 3rd day when the Kurites decided to take our sector with a frontal assault. They marched in formation in waves of about 50 men, their exoskeletons gleaming, plasma weapons scorching the air, and it seemed nothing could stop that death machine. But we were ready. Every window, every door, every corner, people with guns were waiting everywhere. When they entered the kill zone, we opened fire all at once. It was hell. Bullets and plasma bolts flew in both directions, the air filled with screams and the deafening roar of explosions. I lay behind an overturned truck, firing in bursts, reloading, firing again, watching their armor crack, seeing them fall, watching those in the back start to retreat. Fighting next to me was an elderly mechanic named Sergei who worked on the subway and knew every pipe in the city. He was tossing homemade bombs with the calm of a man handing out candy to children. When the attack stalled and the Kurites retreated, leaving dozens of their dead on the platform, Sergei looked at me, grinned, and said that those bastards thought we'd be scared of their toys. But we had built this city with our bare hands in the vacuum of space, and no 4-armed freaks were going to drive us out. By the end of the first week, the Kurites realized they had made a mistake. Their command expected a lightning war, to seize the city in days, crushing the resistance with sheer mass and technology. But Prime didn't break. Every level they took turned into a bloody swamp, devouring their soldiers. I overheard their communications on the intercepted radio frequencies. They were furious, demanding explanations from their commanders as to why primitive humans with outdated weapons were wiping out elite assault squads. But there was no answer. The answer was simple. We were defending our home, and that made us more terrifying than any army in the universe. Every worker, every engineer, every teacher who picked up a weapon knew that behind him were his wife, his children, his parents, his entire life. There was nowhere to retreat. To surrender meant condemning them to slavery or death. That's why we stood our ground. That's why we killed. And the upper-level platforms became covered with enemy bodies, while the city, this insane vertical leviathan, was only beginning to show the invaders what it meant to fight humans on their own turf. Prime stood, bleeding but unbowed, and every day of resistance was a slap in the face to the interstellar empire that thought we were easy prey. After 2 weeks, the Kurates realized that their infantry wouldn't save them and began deploying heavy armor. I first saw their tanks on level 80, monstrous machines the height of a 3-story building, gliding on anti-gravity cushions and bristling with plasma cannons and missile launchers. They moved along the central thoroughfare, which on level 80 is wide enough for shuttles to land, and it seemed nothing could stop them. Their armor shrugged off our anti-tank grenades, and their main cannons reduced buildings to dust with a single volley. A column of 20 such behemoths slowly crawled deeper into the city, sweeping everything from their path, with infantry taking cover behind these steel fortresses. Command was frantically calling for reinforcements, heavy weaponry, anything, because if those machines breached the central sectors, they would cut our defense in half. But General Caro only said one thing over the comms: hold the line and let the snipers work. I didn't understand what she meant then, but an hour later, it all became clear when the real show began. Prime snipers were a special caste, people who had turned the city's verticality into their weapon. I didn't know them personally, only heard legends about a phantom named Katya, a woman who had supposedly killed 70 Kurite commanders in the first 10 days of the war. But that day, I saw their work with my own eyes. The tank column advanced along the thoroughfare, flanked by towering skyscrapers, giants a kilometer high, spaced miles apart, creating huge gaps between them. And from those gaps, from distances of a mile or two, shots started landing. Not automatic fire, but single, precise hits. At first, I didn't get what was happening. The tanks kept moving. But then, I noticed that the Kurite officers, who were coordinating the attack over the radio, started dropping one after another. Every shot, one dead body. They hid behind the tanks, but the bullets found them through gaps, ricocheting from impossible angles. The snipers were firing from different towers, different levels, creating a crossfire from which there was no escape. The enemy began to panic because they couldn't see the shooters, only death arriving from nowhere. Without officers, the column lost coordination, and that's when the tank hunters entered the fray. These were insane volunteers armed with rocket launchers and magnetic mines who crawled out of sewer manholes right under the machine's treads or rappelled down from overhead bridges. I saw one guy, a skeletal engineer from the lower docks, slap a magnetic mine onto a tank's anti-gravity generator and roll away a second before it detonated. The 100-ton machine crashed onto the platform and stopped moving. Another fighter jumped onto the hull of a moving tank, shoved a grenade into a ventilation grate, and jumped off. The tank drove 20 more yards before it was ripped apart from the inside. This wasn't war. It was a hunt, where the prey were steel monsters and the hunters were desperate people for whom the word impossible had lost all meaning. Of the 20 tanks, only 4 reached the sector center, and those were so demoralized by the carnage that they turned around and retreated. The Kurites lost half the column and 24 commanders. We lost 17 men. Cruel mathematics of war, but that day, it was on our side. The Kurites went berserk and started demolishing entire skyscrapers. If the snipers are hiding in the towers, then the towers must go. Heavy artillery from the orbital ships began methodically destroying buildings one after another. I watched the North Spire fall, a 9-kilometer-high tower where 500,000 people lived. An orbital strike hit the base, and the entire structure began to slowly, terrifyingly slowly, topple sideways, fracturing, crumbling, turning into an avalanche of concrete, steel, and glass. The sound was so immense that my ears bled. A dust cloud rose a kilometer high, covering half the level, and for several days we walked in that gray shroud like ghosts. Thousands died. But do you know what happened next? The ruins of the North Spire became the best defensive position on the entire level. Tons of debris turned into a labyrinth where every rock was cover, every beam a barricade. We dug into those ruins like worms into rotting wood, and when the Kurates tried to advance through them, they got bogged down there for 3 weeks, losing men in endless firefights among the rubble. The enemy could destroy our homes, but every destroyed home became a new fortress, and the more they broke Prime, the stronger the city held. Because we weren't defending buildings, we were defending the idea that this piece of ground belonged to us, and no one, no army in the universe, would take it as long as we were alive. By the end of the first month, Prime had ceased to be a single battlefield. It had become 1,000 simultaneous wars raging across different levels, each its own personal hell. I was reassigned to level 50, joining the team of engineer Thomas "Crack" Thomas, a living legend who held the subway hub station through which all supplies for the upper levels flowed. Thomas was a short, wiry man in his 50s with a permanent cigarette between his teeth and hands that could fix anything from a toaster to a nuclear reactor. The station was a massive hub with a dozen tunnels branching out to every corner of the city, and the Kurates knew that if they severed this artery, half the defense would suffocate without ammo and food. They attacked the station every day, sometimes twice, crawling through the tunnels, attempting to storm the platforms, and once even trying to drill through the wall from an adjacent level. But Thomas had turned that station into a fortress. He mined the approaches, set up automated turrets scavenged from decommissioned military junk, and organized a tunnel flooding system in case the enemy pushed too deep. I worked under him, hauling crates of ammunition, repairing wiring after shellings, and I watched this man go 3 days without sleep, holding that hub together by sheer willpower and engineering genius. Once, Thomas told me about Lieutenant Wei from level 30, whom he contacted over a secure line every evening. Wei commanded a company in a residential sector where the fighting was literally room to room. The enemy occupied one half of a building, we held the other, separated by a 3-foot-thick concrete wall. They could hear each other through the floors and ceilings, sometimes firing blindly through the walls, trying to guess the opponent's position. Wei was a young guy who had taught high school history before the war. Now, he was holding the line in a labyrinth of hallways and rooms where every corner could be fatal. Thomas said Wei had devised a tactic, using the building layouts against the enemy. The Kurates didn't understand the architecture of our residential blocks. They would storm apartments through the front doors, only for Wei's people to hit them from the flanks through ventilation shafts, utility ducts, and even sewer pipes. The war had turned into a deadly game of hide-and-seek in concrete boxes, where victory depended not on firepower, but on knowing every crack in the wall. Thomas spoke with respect, saying that if it weren't for guys like Wei holding the residential sectors, the civilians would have perished or fled long ago, but seeing men fight for every room in their homes gave them hope. Down on level 10, in the subterranean highways, Major Ibrahim was fighting a war that was pure madness. I never met him, but I heard stories from the wounded being evacuated through our hub. Ibrahim commanded the remnants of a tank brigade. He had 8 ancient prehistoric tanks that were 50 years old, machines dating back to the planet's colonization era. These iron buckets were slow and lumbering, with armor that almost any modern weapon could pierce. But Ibrahim used them in the highway tunnels where the enemy deployed their assault mechs, 10-foot-tall bipedal war machines armed to the teeth. In an open field, the mechs would have shredded Ibrahim's tanks in minutes, but in narrow tunnels where maneuvering is limited and every turn is a trap, the old tanks were kings. Ibrahim set up ambushes, lured mechs into dead ends, collapsed tunnel ceilings on them, and used smoke screens and feigned retreats. A wounded tanker I spoke with said the major knew those tunnels like the back of his hand because he'd patrolled the subway system long before the war. He turned the highways into his personal hunting grounds, and the Kurates were terrified to go down there because they knew that in the darkness of the tunnels, an old man with ancient tanks was waiting to devour their mechs one by one. All these wars, Thomas's, Wei's, Ibrahim's, and thousands of others, were parts of a single organism named Prime. The city wasn't just resisting, it was adapting, learning to kill the enemy more efficiently every day. Each level became a unique battlefield with its own rules, its own heroes, and its own tragedies. I realized this one night while sitting in the subway station, looking at a defense map where hundreds of dots marked active combat zones. I understood then. We weren't an army. We were cells of a giant creature fighting off an infection. When the enemy broke through on one level, the other levels compensated, shifting resources, people, and weapons. When Wei ran out of ammo on level 30, Thomas sent a transport from our hub. When Ibrahim needed reconnaissance of the subterranean sectors, our engineers hacked the surveillance systems for him. We were separated by miles of concrete and steel, yet bound by a single goal: to survive, to hold, and to make the enemy pay for every yard of our land. And as long as people like Thomas repaired bridges under fire, as long as Wei defended the apartments where children hid, and as long as Ibrahim hunted mechs in the dark, Prime lived, breathed, and fought. No army could kill something made of a million unbreakable wills. 6 weeks into the siege, I forgot what it felt like to eat a full meal. The Kurites were systematically destroying our food sources, bombing the hydroponic farms on the middle levels, poisoning reservoirs, and cutting off the underground pipelines that brought water from deep wells. Our rations had been cut down to a single meal a day, some gray algae paste and protein bars that tasted like cardboard with a hint of machine oil. I'd lost 30 pounds. My ribs were sticking out like a skeleton's, and my hands trembled from weakness. But I kept hauling crates at Thomas's station because to stop meant to die. The worst was seeing the children. Thousands of families were hiding in the bomb shelters beneath our level, and the children would look at you with those huge, hungry eyes as you walked past. And you felt like the lowest bastard because you couldn't even give them an extra piece of bread you didn't have yourself. Mothers gave their portions to their kids, and the elderly refused food in favor of younger fighters. This silent self-sacrifice tore at the heart more fiercely than any bombardment. Once, I saw a man, about 40, a factory worker from the chemical plant, give his ration to a child who wasn't even his son, just a hungry boy. And then the man collapsed from exhaustion right there on the subway platform. We revived him, but the first thing he asked when he woke up was if the boy had eaten it. That's the kind of city I was living in. Those were the kind of people I was fighting with. The reactors were running on their last breath, which meant that power was only available for the absolute essentials: weapons, shields, life support. The lighting was cut for 18 hours a day, and we lived in a perpetual gloom, lighting our way with flashlights and candles, like in some medieval age. Temperatures in the residential sectors dropped to 10 degrees Celsius because the climate control was completely shut down, and I, the former engineer of those very systems, could do nothing about it. There simply wasn't the energy. People froze, huddled under blankets, sleeping piled together to warm each other with body heat. There was no room for the wounded. The hospitals had been overwhelmed by the third week, and now surgeons were operating right in the subway corridors, on makeshift tables made of doors and crates. I saw a doctor amputate a fighter's leg without proper anesthesia, only a local block and a piece of rubber for him to bite down on to keep from swallowing his tongue. The guy screamed so loud it gave me goosebumps, but he survived, and a week later, he was hobbling back to his position on crutches because, he said, you could still shoot with one leg. Death walked the city like an old acquaintance. Every day, we buried dozens of people, wrapping them in sheets and stacking them in the freezers of abandoned food warehouses because there was no time for a proper burial. And then, in the 7th week, the Kurites decided we were broken and broadcast an ultimatum on all frequencies. I heard it over the radio at the station, a mechanical translator reading the terms of surrender from their language. They promised to spare the civilians if the city surrendered within 24 hours. They promised food, medicine, and an end to the bombings. All we had to do was lay down our weapons and acknowledge the authority of the Kurite Empire. I looked at Thomas when the message was broadcast, and I saw his face harden. He put out his cigarette, looked at us, a dozen and a half gaunt, hungry, dirty people holding this hub against the whole world, and asked, "Does anyone want to surrender?" The silence was so profound you could hear water dripping somewhere in the tunnel. Then, one young guy, about 20, quietly said, "My grandfather told stories about the New Eden colony that surrendered to the Karites 10 years ago. They were all driven into labor camps, the women were taken God knows where, and the children were sent for re-education to make them forget their native tongue. He said it was better to die on your feet than live on your knees." And everyone nodded silently. Thomas relayed our decision up the chain of command, level 50 subway station votes to continue resistance. An hour later, the response came. The level 45 Workers' Council, the main coordinating body for the defense, had made its decision by a majority vote. There would be no surrender. They sent the Karites a short message that later became a legend on Prime. "Come and take it." 3 words that meant we would fight until the last man, the last bullet, the last breath. When this was announced across all levels, people cried and laughed simultaneously, hugging each other. Someone started singing the old colonist anthem, and thousands of voices across the city took it up. We were hungry, freezing, and exhausted, but that night I felt a pride so fierce it burned in my chest like fire. We chose freedom. We chose death with honor over a life in chains. And when the Karites renewed their attacks with triple the fury in the morning, we met them with triple the resolve, because we knew we had already won the most important battle, the battle for our own souls, and now they could kill our bodies, but they could never break us. Prime was burning, bleeding, dying, but not yielding, and that was more beautiful than any victory. In the 8th week, the Karites realized that their horizontal advance was leading nowhere, and they decided to strike at the very heart, a vertical breakthrough to the generator core on level 0. If they destroyed the reactors, the city would die in hours, the shields would fail, life support systems would shut down, and Prime would become a giant tomb. I learned about this when a group of their assault troops broke into our station through a ventilation shaft. They were drilling downward, chewing through the city level by level, using elevator shafts and utility conduits as invasion routes. First, they blew the main ventilation grate, and 24 heavily armored Karites, bristling with weapons, stormed into the station. The fight was swift and brutal. We repelled them at the cost of 5 men, but I understood this was only the beginning. Thomas contacted command, and we were told to prepare for the worst. The enemy would break through vertically across the entire city simultaneously, turning every vertical artery into a battlefield. I was given a squad of 20 fighters and the order to hold elevator shaft number 17 at all costs, because it led directly to the hub communications that provided access to the lower levels. I looked into that black hole, dropping miles down, and realized that we would most likely all die there in the coming days. The fighting in the shafts was true hell, worse than anything I had seen the entire war. Karites descended from above, using ropes and anti-gravity packs, firing down, while we fired up, and bullets ricocheted off the steel walls, turning the shaft into a buzzing swarm of death. We set up platforms at different levels of the shaft, barricaded ourselves, and mined the approaches, but the enemy came in waves, never stopping. I lost track of the days, sleeping in fits of 2 or 3 hours, eating on the move, firing until the ammo ran out, then reloading and firing again. Bodies fell down, disappearing into the darkness, and I didn't know how many had piled up at the bottom, hundreds, thousands. The air was thick with the smell of blood, gunpowder, and fear. The walls were covered in brown smears. Human blood is red, Karite blood is greenish, and they mixed into a sickening brown color. Once, I saw a guy from my squad fall off a platform during the fighting. He was clipped by a plasma charge and plunged, screaming, into the abyss, and I couldn't do anything but keep shooting because stopping meant dying. We lost men every day, but the enemy also suffered monstrous losses. For them, every meter down became more deadly because the deeper they crawled, the better we knew the terrain and the tighter the defense became. On the 12th day of fighting in the shaft, an order came that I couldn't understand at first. Prepare for section collapse. Command had decided to sacrifice entire blocks of the city to stop the vertical breakthrough. Engineers had planted explosives in the load-bearing structures, and when the enemy had advanced as deep as possible into the shafts and tunnels, when thousands of their soldiers were down there, we detonated everything simultaneously. I was at a safe distance at the subway station when it happened, but I felt the entire level shake, the steel and concrete collapsing somewhere nearby. The sound was like the world splitting in half. An entire section of the city, several square kilometers in area, collapsed, burying everyone inside, both the enemy and our own, who hadn't managed to evacuate. We killed several thousand Kuwaits and several hundred of our own with a single push of a button. I knew the guys who stayed there on purpose, volunteers who said they would hold the enemy to the last and buy time for the demolition. Their names will be forgotten, no monuments will be erected, but they saved the city, buying us time with their lives. After the collapse, I couldn't sleep for days. I saw their faces, heard their voices, and understood that I could have been one of them if fate had been different. The collapses were repeated in dozens of locations throughout Prime. The city was turning into a giant trap that devoured the armies of both sides. The Kuwaits continued to push down, but every one of their breakthroughs ended with tons of concrete on their heads, and those who survived met even fiercer resistance on the next level. They never reached the generator core. The defense of level 0 was so dense that the enemy got bogged down somewhere on level 15, losing tens of thousands of soldiers in the vertical meat grinders. I looked at the city map after that carnage and didn't recognize it. Entire sections were marked red, collapsed, impassable, burying thousands of people and tens of thousands of enemies. Prime had turned into a giant graveyard, a monument to stubbornness and sacrifice, a place where architecture became a weapon, and every building a tomb for those who tried to take it. The city walls were soaked with two kinds of blood so deeply that it seemed the concrete itself had become alive, feeding on death and fury. And I realized that even if we lost this war, Prime would never be forgotten. It would go down in history as the city that ate an entire army and did not choke. I first heard about Sergeant Oleg the Bulldozer 10 days after the collapses, when a wounded soldier from level 72 was brought into our station. The guy was covered in bandages but spoke excitedly, recounting how he had personally seen this Oleg choke a heavily armored Kuwait with his bare hands. At first I didn't believe it. I thought it was shell shock or the morphine, but then others confirmed it. It turned out Oleg was a simple dock loader, a behemoth 6'3" and nearly 300 pounds of pure muscle who, before the war, hauled containers manually where machinery couldn't reach. When the war started, he was assigned to defend a narrow pass between two towers on level 72, given a machine gun, and told, "Hold until you run out of ammo." Oleg held for 3 days, mowing down enemies in bursts until his belts ran dry. When they did, he didn't retreat. He simply picked up the machine gun like a club and went hand-to-hand against an entire squad of assault troops. Witnesses said he smashed their exoskeletons with his bare fists, snapped their necks, and threw one Kuwait into another, until the enemy panicked and pulled back because they couldn't comprehend how an unarmored man could be such a monster. After that fight, they nicknamed him the Bulldozer, and the name spread across the city within a day. I never met him personally, but knowing he was out there, still fighting on the upper levels, gave us a primal sense of certainty. If men like that were alive, we hadn't lost yet. Then there was the story of Nurse Amara, who became a legend in a completely different way. Amara worked at a field hospital on level 65, a tiny woman in her 30s with perpetually tired eyes and hands that had saved hundreds of lives. One day, an entire company, about 80 fighters, was cut off from the main force in a mined territory. The Kuwaits had deliberately seeded the whole sector with mines to lure our troops in and blow them up. The company commander was screaming over the radio that they were trapped, any movement meant death, and the enemy was already pulling up artillery to wipe them off the face of the planet. And then Amara got on the line and said she knew that sector because she used to live there before the war. She knew every street, every corner, and she would lead them out. They told her it was insanity, that she would die, but she simply took a flashlight, walked out of the hospital, and stepped into the minefield alone, bypassing the traps by memory, with the company following her step for step. They moved in complete silence for 2 hours. Every step could have been their last, but Amara led them, like blind children, through that hell. She brought every single man out without a single loss, and when they returned, the fighters said she walked so confidently it was as if she could see the mines through the ground, as if death itself parted before her out of respect. After that, Amara was called the guardian angel of Prime, and the wounded asked specifically for her to treat them, believing that if she could save a company in a minefield, she could pull them back from the grave. But the strangest legend was Petka, a 12-year-old kid from level 48 who became the best courier for the entire defense. Before the war, he was just a regular scamp, climbing through ventilation shafts, exploring every hidden corner of his neighborhood, sneaking out of school through utility conduits he knew better than any engineer. When the siege began, communication between the levels faltered, radio intercepts worked against us, and we needed live couriers who could physically deliver critical messages by navigating through combat zones. Adults were dying by the dozens. The Karites controlled most open routes, and the alternate paths were too narrow or dangerous. And then Petka appeared. He came to the command post, said he knew passages no one else could use, and asked to be given a chance. They agreed because there was no choice, and the boy vanished into a ventilation shaft with a sealed packet. 8 hours later, he emerged on level 32, delivered the message, and returned with the answer, safe and sound. After that, Petka became irreplaceable. He squeezed through places grown men in full gear couldn't pass, slid through pipes barely half a meter in diameter, and climbed shafts hanging over kilometer-deep drops, never once losing a single message. The Karites didn't even know of his existence, and the defense commanders prayed that nothing would happen to the boy, because he was the slender thread connecting the city's scattered parts, and if that thread broke, the defense coordination would collapse. All these stories, the bulldozer, Amara, Petka, were passed from mouth to mouth, gaining details, turning into myths that kept us afloat more effectively than food or ammunition. I understood then that the Karites were beginning to fear not our weapons or our fortifications. They were beginning to fear us, the people of this city who fit none of their tactical calculations. Their computers couldn't predict that a dock worker would fight bare-handed against exoskeletons, that a nurse would lead a company through a minefield from memory, or that a 12-year-old boy would become an indispensable link in the defense. We fought like devils, died like gods, and every day new heroes were born. Some blew themselves up with an enemy tank, some held a corridor alone against dozens of enemies, and some simply refused to give up when any rational person would have surrendered. Prime was turning ordinary people into legends, and the legends made the city immortal, because as long as there are those willing to become heroes, the city cannot fall. I was just an engineer, hauling crates and firing when ordered, but even I felt that I had become part of something greater, something that would outlive all of us and remain in the galaxy's memory as a lesson. Never, ever wage war against people on their own ground, because they will turn into monsters to defend their home. On the 91st day of the siege, I woke up to Thomas shaking my shoulder and telling me that everything had changed. I opened my eyes, not understanding where I was or who I was. I'd slept 4 hours in the last 3 days, and my brain refused to function normally. Thomas thrust a mug of something hot that pretended to be coffee into my hands and pointed at a tactical tablet screen. It showed the map of Prime, and I saw figures that were staggering. The Karites controlled 40% of the city. Red zones covered nearly half the map, but the enemy casualty figures were insane. For every captured block, they paid with 10 soldiers, for every street, a squad, for every building, a company. Simple math showed their army was bleeding out faster than it was gaining territory, but they kept pushing, throwing fresh units into the fire. Thomas said their command was furious to the point of madness. They couldn't believe some human city could hold out for 3 months against an entire armada that took planets in weeks. And now came the news that changed everything. The Alliance fleet had broken through to Omega-7, an orbital battle had begun, and the Kharites were caught between a hammer and an anvil. I stared at the subway station ceiling and heard the distant rumble of explosions somewhere high above the clouds, where giant ships were annihilating each other in the void of space, and for the first time in 3 months, I felt something akin to hope. 2 days after the orbital battle began, an order went out across all levels. Commanders of all units were to report to an emergency meeting in the central bunker on level 40. I wasn't summoned. I was nobody, just an ordinary fighter from the subway station, but Thomas took me along as his assistant, saying it would be useful for me to see how decisions were made at the very top. We descended broken stairwells, passed through 3 checkpoints where they checked documents and scanned for enemy implants, and entered a massive hall where hundreds of people were gathered. Officers, militia commanders, representatives of the workers' councils, engineers, medics. General Caro stood in the center, and I saw her up close for the second time in the whole war. She had aged 10 years in those 3 months. Her face was etched with new wrinkles, but her eyes burned with such fire that you wanted to look away. She waited until everyone was assembled, then activated a holo projector and showed us a plan that took my breath away. A counter-offensive from the central core in all directions simultaneously. Not a defense, not a hold, but an attack on all fronts at once, a blow intended to shatter the enemy's positions into pieces. One of the officers said it was madness, that we didn't have the strength for such an offensive, that we were exhausted and barely holding on. Caro looked at him and uttered a phrase I will remember for life. "They think we are broken. Let's show those bastards the fury of Prime when people decide they have nothing left to lose." The plan was simple and insane at the same time. All reserves, everyone who could still hold a weapon, all guerrilla groups in the captured territories were to strike simultaneously at dawn in 3 days. The central core of the city, levels 30 through 60, which we held in a death grip, would become the breakthrough point. From there, waves of attackers would pour out in all directions, up and down, through all the highways and corridors, while partisans in the captured levels would hit the enemy in the back. The Kharites would be caught in a vice, their communications would snap, their supply lines would halt, and while their fleet fought the Alliance in orbit, their ground army would drown in chaos. Caro assigned the tasks. Who would attack upward via the elevator shafts? Who would break through the underground tunnels? Who would blow up enemy strongholds from the inside? Thomas was tasked with securing the transport flows in the subway, shifting reserves where the breakthrough was successful, and plugging holes where the enemy tried to counterattack. As part of his team, I was to help coordinate this madness. When the meeting ended, people dispersed in silence, but I saw something new in their eyes. Not fear or fatigue, but the cold determination of those ready to put everything on one card because there were simply no other cards left. We had spent 3 months dying on the defensive, and now was the time to show the enemy that the dead know how to bite. On the night before the attack, something happened that I won't forget even if I live 100 years. Someone on level 45 started singing, a single voice, the old colonists' anthem, a song our grandparents sang when they built the first domes on the bare rock of Omega-7. I heard it over the open comm channel at the subway station. First one voice, then a second, a third, a 10th joined in. 10 minutes later, the entire level was singing. 20 minutes later, neighboring levels were singing, and the wave of song rolled across the city from bottom to top and top to bottom, a million voices merging into one roar that drowned out even the distant explosions in orbit. I stood on the station platform and listened to Prime sing as this wounded, bleeding leviathan of steel and concrete found its voice, and that voice was both beautiful and terrifying. People sang about freedom, about the land they wouldn't surrender to anyone, about the children who would live here after us. And I sang along with everyone, even as tears streamed down my face, because I knew that tomorrow many of the voices I heard now would die. We sang for 2 hours until our throats were raw, and when the song faded, the city fell into the silence before the storm. I lay down to sleep, knowing it might be the last night of my life, but I fell asleep with a smile because Prime was alive, Prime was singing, and no force in the universe could kill something that possessed such a will to live. I met the dawn of the 94th day of the war on the platform of the subway station, gripping my rifle so tightly my knuckles were white. Thomas was checking the radios, coordinating the final preparations, and I looked at the people around me. 150 fighters gathered from all sectors of our area, exhausted, hungry, but with eyes burning with a strange fire. At 5 in the morning, a single signal sounded across all channels, 3 short beeps, and what would later be called the Great Breakthrough began. I first heard a distant thunder somewhere above. Then it rolled in waves across all levels. It was thousands of people bursting out of cover simultaneously, attacking in every direction at once. Our squad plunged into the subway tunnel leading to the captured sectors, and I ran in that torrent of bodies, thinking of nothing, only feeling the adrenaline burn away the fatigue and fear. We erupted onto the platform of an enemy stronghold like a tsunami. The Kurites hadn't expected an attack. For 3 months, they had pressed us, and we had only defended, and now the defenders they thought were half dead were surging toward them. The fight was swift and brutal. We simply overwhelmed them with numbers and fury. I fired without aiming, just emptying clips into the red silhouettes, and when the platform was clear, I saw we had lost 20 men in 3 minutes. But we had captured a key hub through which the enemy was shifting reinforcements. Thomas was shouting over the radio that the breakthrough was successful, that the same thing was happening all over the city, and I understood. We weren't just attacking. We were breaking the spine of an entire army with one blow. An hour after the counterattack began, I heard panic in the Kurite ranks over the intercepted frequencies. Their commanders demanded an explanation of how this was possible, how a dead city had suddenly come alive and was biting at their throats. Partisans in the captured levels, who had been hiding in ruins and ventilation shafts for 3 months, came out all at once and hit the enemy in the back, blowing up ammunition depots, cutting the throats of sentries, mining the retreat routes. The Kurites were caught in a vice between our offensive and the partisan attacks from the rear. Their communications snapped, units lost contact with each other, and the monolithic war machine that had been methodically grinding down our city for 3 months began to fall apart. I saw it with my own eyes when our squad broke through to level 75. An entire column of enemy armored vehicles was stopped dead on the highway because the partisans had blown the bridge ahead and mined the road behind. When we attacked them from the flanks, they didn't even try to organize a defense. They just ran, abandoning their vehicles. Thomas said over the radio that this was happening all over the city. The enemy was breaking, losing the will to fight, because for the first time in 3 months, they realized they could lose. These invaders, who took entire worlds, who were taught that humans were a weak race incapable of real war, were now running from hungry, exhausted militiamen. And it was both beautiful and terrifying to witness the revenge for 3 months of hell coming true. Something unbelievable was happening in orbit, and I heard about it from the radio operator who monitored the Alliance military frequencies. Admiral Jacquard, the commander of the Kurite fleet, realized his ground army was collapsing and, in a fit of rage, ordered Prime to be wiped off the planet, to simply scorch the city to ashes with orbital cannons, along with his own troops who were stuck there. He preferred total destruction to admitting defeat. The ships began turning their weapons toward the city, and in that moment, I thought we had won the war only to burn up in the final second. But an Alliance frigate that had broken through the screen made it first. I didn't see it, but the radio operator recounted in real time how heavy missiles launched from the frigate went straight into the Kurite flagship, how the enormous dreadnought, the size of a small city, began to break apart right there in orbit. Admiral Jacques burned along with his ship and his fleet, having lost command and witnessing the destruction of the flagship, began to retreat, abandoning their ground forces to their fate. At that moment, standing in a destroyed corridor on level 75 amid corpses and smoke, I heard General Caro's voice over the radio announcing to all units, "The enemy fleet is fleeing, the ground forces are cut off. Hunt them down to the last man." And the city roared with fury and joy at the same time, because it tasted victory after 3 months when it seemed victory would never come. The next 7 days were spent clearing out the area, the methodical, ruthless destruction of the remnants of the enemy army, which was no longer an army but had devolved into crowds of disorganized, demoralized soldiers without supplies or orders. Kuraits began surrendering in parts. First small groups, then entire companies, then battalions laid down their weapons and emerged with their hands up. I saw them being herded onto platforms in huge columns of prisoners, thousands of four-armed creatures in shattered armor. And in their eyes was shock. They couldn't believe they had lost to a handful of humans they were supposed to crush in a week. Some units tried to break through to the spaceports, hoping to evacuate, but the partisans and regular squads cut them down on the approaches, showing no mercy. On the 7th day after the counterattack began, the last organized Kurait unit, the remnants of the elite guard, about 300 men entrenched on level 98, requested a parley and surrendered under guarantees of life. Their commander, a tall, four-armed officer with a scarred face, handed his weapon directly to General Caro, and I watched her accept his plasma rifle without a single expression on her face, simply nodding and ordering the prisoners to be taken to the camps. The war was over. Prime had stood firm. 100 kilometers of steel and fury had defeated an army that took worlds. I stood on the subway platform, watching the dawn of the 102nd day of the war, and felt no joy, only emptiness, exhaustion, and a quiet bewilderment that I was still alive when so many of those I started this war with were dead. Prime stood, and it was the most terrifying sight I had ever seen, more frightening than any battle, any bombardment. The 100-kilometer-high hive city was so mutilated that it seemed it would collapse entirely at any moment. Entire sections were missing, as if pieces of flesh had been ripped from a living body. Skyscrapers stood with their guts burned out, building facades were riddled with thousands of shell holes, and some towers hung at impossible angles, held up only by rebar and the engineering genius of our grandparents. I walked the levels after the war and counted the dead. Not literally, of course. Special teams did that, but I saw the numbers in the reports Thomas showed me at the subway station. 1 million people. A full 1,000,000 lives wiped out in 100 days of war, 10 times more than the Kuraits lost in soldiers. Yet we stood, and they fled, and that was the only math that mattered. Civilians, militia, soldiers, children, old people, all were buried in mass graves on the city outskirts or still lay under rubble we couldn't clear because we lacked the equipment and manpower. But Prime lived. The reactors on level 0 hummed, pumping energy through the city's arteries. The hydroponic farms that survived were yielding crops again, and in the residential sectors, people were returning to their shattered apartments and starting to rebuild them with their bare hands, just as their grandparents did a century ago, when there was nothing here at all. A month after the war ended, a delegation from the Galactic Alliance arrived at Omega 7. Diplomats, military historians, scientists who wanted to understand how this was even possible. I saw them in the central plaza of level 40, where an official ceremony was held in honor of the city's defenders. These alien, arrogant bastards in their elaborate uniforms looked at us, the ragged and the crippled, like strange animals in a zoo. They asked questions through translators. How did we hold out? What was the key tactic? Which weapons played a decisive role? General Caro, who received them, answered with one phrase I will never forget. There was no secret tactic. There was only one thing. We were defending our home, and as long as a person can hold a weapon, they will fight for what they hold dear. The historians wrote it down, nodded, and made thoughtful faces, but I saw the incomprehension in their eyes. They couldn't grasp how a primitive emotion like love for a piece of land could defeat superior technology in numbers. One of them, a gray-haired professor from some distant planet, later said in an interview that the battle for Prime would go into all military academy textbooks with a single note. Never, under any circumstances, engage in urban warfare with humans on their territory, because they will turn every street into your hell and fight until their last breath. I read that and smiled wryly, because they still didn't understand the main thing. We didn't fight to the last breath out of some tactical necessity. We simply couldn't do otherwise, because our families were behind us and there was nowhere to retreat. Life returned to Prime in strange, unexpected ways. I learned that Katya, the legendary phantom sniper who killed over 100 enemy commanders, donated her rifle to the Defense Museum that was organized on Level 50 in memory of the fallen. She came in ordinary civilian clothes, a thin woman in her 30s with empty eyes, placed the weapon on the stand, and left without saying a word. Thomas, my commander, returned to what he did before the war, restoring the subway, repairing tunnels, and setting up the transport system that bound the city together. I worked under him because I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't go back to being a climate control engineer. That system simply didn't exist anymore, and I couldn't imagine myself returning to adjusting apartment temperatures after everything I had witnessed. Once, I ran into Petka, that 12-year-old courier who spent 3 months crawling through ventilation shafts between the front lines. He was walking to school, a regular kid with a backpack, and I called out to him, asking how he was. Petka shrugged and said he was fine, but the teachers were making him do homework. Can you believe it? After everything, they want me to solve math problems? I laughed for the first time in many weeks and thought that if Petka was going to school again, then it really was over, and the world was returning to some semblance of normalcy, albeit one that was forever scarred. 6 months after the battle, I heard that in the Galactic Congress, that enormous parliament of all sentient races, a new saying had emerged among diplomats and military personnel. Do not wake a sleeping Terran. He will turn your army into an Omega-7. At first, I didn't understand what it meant, but then it dawned on me. Prime had become synonymous with catastrophe, a name for a battle that cannot be won, a warning to all who thought humans were easy prey. Somewhere on distant stations, alien generals were showing their cadets holo recordings of the siege of Prime and saying, "Look, this is what happens when you underestimate a primitive species that has neither your technology nor your numbers, but possesses something you lack, an absolute irrational willingness to die for their ground." The Kharid Empire never attacked human colonies again after Omega-7. They had learned a lesson that cost them an entire army and a flagship dreadnought. I stood on the Level 96 observation deck, the same place I stood on the first day of the war when the sky tore open, and I looked at the stars, thinking that somewhere out there, in the depths of space, there are races that now fear us, not because we are strong, but because we are mad, willing to fight in conditions where any rational being would have capitulated. Prime stood, wounded but alive, and every crack in its walls was a scar reminding the universe. Do not mess with humans on their own land, because they don't know the word impossible and will fight bare-handed against gods if they must protect what they love.